Hi, I'm Mike from 1A Auto. We've been selling auto parts for over 30 years.
Right, so we have our hood removed just for the sake of the video, but you don't have to remove the hood to do this. At this point, we're gonna remove this cover. Just lift up and then just wiggle it forward. It comes off. Because we're gonna be disconnecting the wire to the alternator, we're gonna disconnect the battery so we don't arc anything out. So I'm gonna take a 10mm wrench and loosen up the negative terminal on the battery. We'll just set that aside. All right, we're gonna take this snorkel off. It goes between the air box and the throttle body. What we need to do under here is a little retainer that's holding this coolant upper radiator hose on. So just push that down. You can use a trim tool if you need to. And then over here, there's a little hose that connects this to the upper valve cover. So we'll just pop that off right there. We have these worm clamps, this one right here and this one right here, over on the throttle body side as well. We're gonna take an 8mm socket, an extension and a ratchet. You could also use a straight screwdriver. We'll loosen these up. And then same with over here. Loosen that one up. Once those are loose, you can take this right here, push it in like that. And then there's a little grommet right here. You're gonna have to lift up to release that and then pull straight forward and twist a little bit and this whole snorkel will come off. Okay, we're gonna disconnect the connector for the throttle body. Sometimes there's a lock on here, a little gray tab that you'd have to pull out. This one doesn't have it. So we can just push down on the release and pull the connector off. Next, we're gonna come over here to the alternator. I'm gonna disconnect this connector right here. You're just gonna push down on this lock on the connector. Push down like that and then pull it out. And then next we will disconnect this wire right here that goes to the alternator. It should be a 10mm nut. So we'll take that off. Make sure you have the battery disconnected at this time. So I'll use a 10mm wrench. This happens to be a ratchet wrench, but you can just use a regular wrench or a socket and a ratchet. Once you loosen it up, you should be able to do it by hand. Pull that nut off, then we can pull the wire out. I'm gonna put the nut back on here so I remember that it goes for the alternator there. And we can move that harness aside so it's out of our way. Next, I'm gonna disconnect this connector. This goes to the map sensor. Just push down on this retainer and pull it out. I'm gonna use a 10mm wrench to take this nut off right here. You can use a socket or a regular wrench. We want to take these 3 bolts out here on this cover. This holds the wiring harness down, so I'll use a 10mm ratchet wrench. I'm going to loosen them all up first and then do it by hand. And I can spin them out by hand and take this cover off. Might be a little easier if you pull it to the side like that. At this point, I'm going to disconnect these fuel injectors on this side. I'm going to use a pick tool to release the lock first. Come in behind here. Pull the lock up. Once the lock is pulled up, I can take my fingers and just squeeze the tab and pull it up. See, that releases. And we're going to do that for the rest of these, and then we'll do it on the other side. This back one's a little bit tricky. Sometimes you can go to the front of the lock and push it up just like that. Sometimes that's a little easier. And pull that up. Just push those out of the way. On this side, we're going to move some of the wires out of our way. Just lift up on this and push it to the side. You can actually, over on the back side, there's a cover. You can get it past the cover. It'll make it easier when we're removing the intake. All right, so this purge valve, we can disconnect the connector right here. Just slide this out and then pull it out, just like that. And then the vacuum line that goes back to the gas tank. And push down on the lock and pull the hose straight back, and that'll release that. We can leave this purge valve and this hose connected because it will come out with the intake. Now we can disconnect these fuel injector connectors. Take my pick. I can pull up on the front of the lock like that. That's a little bit easier. And then pinch it. Under normal circumstances, what we would do to release the pressure, we would pull the fuel pump relay or the fuel pump fuse, which is number 20 in this. In this vehicle, as you can see, there is no relay there where the fuel pump relay should be, and then the fuse should be right there. So that is actually part of this fuse block. It's internal to it, so there's nothing I can do for that. So we're not going to purge we're not going to release the pressure by disconnecting the relay and starting the vehicle and letting it drain down. So, but under normal circumstances, that's what we would do. So to release the fuel pressure, there normally is a cap right here. There's no cap on this vehicle, it's missing. But for us to disconnect the fuel line, instead of getting sprayed while we're disconnecting it, we're just gonna release the pressure here. I'm just gonna take a rag, stick it over here, and then a screwdriver, and I'm gonna release the pressure, just like that. It didn't take much, not that much came out, so we're good to go now. Make sure you wear safety glasses when you do this. You don't want to get sprayed in the eyes with gas. Okay. There's a bunch of different types of fuel disconnect tools. This one will work. This one will work. We actually sell a kit similar to this at 1aauto.com, but you're gonna need a fuel disconnect tool. Otherwise, you will never be able to separate those lines. So the fuel line is right here. There's a little lock right here. Lift up on the back side of the lock like that, and then pull it forward. Just like that. Just set that aside. So I'll show you how to use both of these disconnect tools. This is the 3/8 size. I'm going to slide this plastic on like this. I'm going to pull the line forward first, and then you're going to push the plastic in. And that releases little fingers in there. And there we go. And you just pull the line off like that. As you can see, there's little fingers in there that release it. And some fuel is going to spill out. You can put a rag in the back to catch it. I'll just show you how the other tool works. This tool is a little bit easier. You're going to take the bigger end of the tool and slide this on here, and then just push. While you're pushing it with your hand, grab the line and pull back. We are going to remove these 8mm bolts that hold the intake on. I'm going to use an 8mm socket, an extension, and a ratchet. There's 5 on each side, so 10 total. So start removing these. Now they're going to stay with the intake manifold, so you don't have to pull them out completely. I mean, you can if you want to, but they will stay with it. Just make sure they're completely loose. In the back here, I switched to a shorter extension so that I can get to the bolts without hitting the firewall here. Now I'll remove the bolts on this side. Just move the wiring harness out of your way. Now there's these bolts right here for the fuel rail. We're going to leave those attached because the fuel rail is going to come up with the intake manifold. Now we're taking the last one out. This vent hose right here is in my way, so I'm just going to move this. This is for like the PCV system. There's a little lock on this over here. You just push that lock and then pull on the hose up. All right, so now all my intake bolts are loose, disconnected. So just gonna move this wiring harness out of the way a little bit. There's a little shield on the back here. Move that behind there. And pull up on the intake. And because the bolts are in the back, you gotta lift them so that they're past the holes. This one seems like it's sticking a little bit. And if that gives you a lot of trouble, you can pull the bolts out. But just pull the bolts out like that. So this vacuum hose is connected to the intake right here for the brake booster. So what I'm going to do is just grab and just wiggle it back and forth gently and pull that off. I'll feed that hose this way. You're going to angle the intake up like this. Pull that hose out, and we can pull the intake off. All right, since we got the intake off, we don't want any debris or anything to go in these holes, so we can take some rags and just stuff them in the holes. You do want to make sure you remember to remove these when we put it back together. Just put those like that. That'll prevent anything from falling into the engine. There's a lot of debris in here from mice coming in here and putting nests and stuff, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a vacuum and vacuum out this area. One thing to keep in mind, if you're using an electric vacuum, you don't want to suck up any gasoline. Okay, and before I put the intake back on, what I want to do is I want to clean the area around where the intake ports are. I'm going to use a rag and some brake parts cleaner. And just wipe just a little bit around this area. And I'm going to do that to all 8 of the intake ports. All right, so I cleaned all those ports up pretty good. I'm just going to take a little bit of compressed air while those rags are still in there and just clean up this area. And before I put the intake on, I'm going to pull all these out. Make sure nothing went in there. You can take the compressed air and just blow out those holes as well. Okay, if you were replacing this intake manifold, the next step, what you would want to do is remove this hose for the evap purge solenoid. there's a little lock right here. You push down on that, lift that up, and then you could slide this out, or take these 8mm bolts out of the fuel rail, and then you can pull the fuel rail up, wiggle it back and forth, pull the throttle body off. There's 10mm nuts and 10mm bolts. Pull the map sensor out. There's a little lock on here, has to slide, and then pull this PCV tube out. How you get this out is you would have to pull this stud off, and then you could twist this tube sideways, and then this will pull out. On the back side, you would have to pull this hose off, use some pliers and squeeze that clamp, pull the hose off, and then this cover, there is a 10mm nut right there, and that will come off. And then if we flip it over, these 8mm bolts, we'll just pull these out for now. Otherwise, they're just gonna fall out. Flip this over, and we can replace the gaskets. We're gonna replace the gaskets when we reinstall this one. To replace the gasket, there's a little lock right here. We're gonna pull that off right there. Little lock right here, and then one on the end. That just holds the gasket. Pull that off. And before I put the new one on, I'm gonna take a rag, just wipe down this area. There's a little bit of dirt and debris in there. These little insulation things go right here. These try to keep rodents out, but for the most part, mice still get in there and stuff, so. We'll wipe these down here. And we'll take our new gasket and slide it on that side, and then slide it to that lock and that lock, just like that. And we'll do the same for the other side. Now we're going to reinstall the intake. You want to make sure you got all the rags out of your ports and everything's nice and clean in that area. We did take all the bolts out of the intake. You can leave them in, but it's a little bit easier to finagle the intake in with the bolts out. So now I'm gonna set this here. I'm gonna take this hose and feed it through here. I'm gonna go under this wiring harness here. I'm gonna angle it in the back. And this wiring harness will come over on this side. Kind of helps to keep the fuel rails on, because then you can use the fuel rails as like handles. You can move it around a little bit. So watch out for the injector connectors, the fuel injector connectors, because you don't want to squish them. That's all lined up like that. And just give it a little shake, make sure it's down all the way. Then we can install the bolts. So the way the bolts work on this, you kind of got to angle it a little bit. If you put them in straight, they won't go in. So you just angle it so that collar will go down. And just give it a little turn. So I'm going to do this. There's 5 on this side, and I'll do it with the remaining 5 on the other side as well. Now I'm going to start snugging these down a little bit with a 8mm socket and an extension, just by hand. Just go around the whole intake and just snug them up before we torque them. All right, at this point we're going to torque these intake bolts in sequence. We start with the middle on the passenger side. We're going to torque these to 44 inch-pounds first, do them all in sequence, and then we're going to go back and torque them to 89 inch-pounds. We'll start with the passenger side, make sure that's good, and then go to the driver's side center and pretty much do it evenly, alternating. And then you would move to the driver's side, the next one back, and then the passenger side, Next one forward from the center and alternating back and forth. Now I'm going to do the second stage of torquing to 89 inch-pounds. Make sure you're on inch-pounds, not foot-pounds. And we'll torque these in sequence, the same sequence we did before. Okay, we'll reinstall this vacuum hose that goes to the brake booster. What we're going to do is just slide this into the grommet. And over here, we're going to re-hook up the fuel injectors, the connectors. We're just going to slide it right back on the fuel injector and then push down on the lock. And we'll do this for all the rest of them. And we'll do the same for the passenger side. Just push it down and lock it in. Next, we're going to hook up this fuel line. Just slide this on right there. Attach it to the fuel rail. We have this retainer that holds the fuel rail on. Just going to slide this on this way and then lock it down. That'll keep the fuel rail from popping off. Next, we're going to install this evap line. It goes to the purge valve right here. Just slide it on, lock it in. And then we have our connector, electrical connector. Connect that to the purge valve, just like that. Next, we're going to install this wiring harness over here, and then this will slide on right there. This connector will connect to the map sensor. Just line that up, lock it in. This cover is going to go back here like this, and it's going to go over these wiring harnesses right here. And we'll take these 10mm bolts and put these in. These 3. And I'll just tighten them up by hand first. Then I'm going to use a wrench. I'll use a ratchet wrench. If you don't have a ratchet wrench, you can just use a regular wrench or a socket and a ratchet. And just snug these up. Remember, it's plastic, so don't over tighten it. It's just got to be snug. We'll take the 10mm nut and stick it back on this bracket and snug this up. Now we're going to reconnect this PCV hose. This goes to the upper valve cover. And just slide that on. We can connect the throttle body connector right there. Just lock that in. Then we're going to take the 12-volt feed to the battery that goes to the alternator. And we're going to pull this nut off the alternator that we put on before, so we didn't lose it. Put this wire on here, and then reinstall the nut. Then we'll take a 10mm wrench and snug this up. Not too tight, just snug. And we'll put the boot, the protective boot that goes over that. We can connect this connector to the alternator. Just line that up, click it down. Install the snorkel and slide this back here. So we're going to slide this over the throttle body first. You're going to hold up on this part of the snorkel because it's going to go over this little stud over here. And then you can push it down on the stud where that rubber grommet is. And we can reconnect this hose. You're just going to click it in, just like that. Now we can hook this side to the airbox. Just slide this on. Underneath here, the upper radiator hose, that just locks into there. Now I'm going to tighten up this worm clamp with a 8mm socket, an extension, and a ratchet. You can use a straight blade screwdriver as well. Not too tight, just snug. We'll do the same on the throttle body side. At this point, I'm going to reconnect the battery. Install the negative terminal. Then I'll use a 10mm ratchet wrench. You could use a regular wrench or a socket. And we'll snug this up. Now we can reinstall this cover. We're going to slide it underneath the heater hoses over here. Slide it back, and then there's 2 rubber grommets under here. Just line up with those studs and push it down.
Thanks for watching. Visit us at oneauto.com for quality auto parts, fast and free shipping, and the best customer service in the industry.